So, in other words, enterprise architecture is executed and indirectly defined differently depending on how it is implemented in an organization.
Why you felt the need to create this simplified definition or this simplified?
I think enterprise architecture is practiced differently in each organization, allowing it to help these organizations achieve their business goals and objectives. I think it's very important for an organization to have a kind of control or have this overall structure clarity, if you will, with regards to the strategy an organization has and how to be able to achieve this strategy.
Because some people want to skip definitions and jump straight into frameworks, I think this will create a lot of consequences and risks without first defining and agreeing on what EA really means for the organization. Having a strong EA definition in place act as a kind of compass for new teams or practices that are just getting started.
Now, one of the things enterprise architecture needs to do is to provide this shared understanding, this common language even. And this means defining enterprise architecture in the context of the organization rather than relying on textbook definition.
100% believe without a sharing understanding, even the best tools and frameworks can lead to the wrong direction. What if I told you that enterprise architecture doesn't have one definition, but dozens? Most organizations define EA differently. So which one is the right one? In this episode of the EA Explained series, we will break down the most common definitions, expose the risks behind skipping defining EA, and share a simplified version that can act as a compass to your organization. If you have ever struggled to explain what enterprise architecture really means, this session is for you. Welcome to another episode of the EA Explained. Well, this module is all about definitions that will guide your work, shape your approach that you are following, and help you align with people across the whole organization. Let's do a quick recap of what we discussed in our last episode and provide some context on what we are going to discuss in today's one. In our last episode, we finished exploring the roots of enterprise architecture, how it evolved, and the frameworks that helped shape it. Now it's time to tackle a question that sounds simple but complex in sometimes, which is what exactly is enterprise architecture? Some people say that enterprise architecture is about enterprise, but what do really I need to do? Eric, glad to have you with us again. And are you ready to dive into what EA really means?
Absolutely, I am. Let's start the session.
So, you know that EA is often influenced by industry, maturity levels, and other context, internal or external. Also, some people claim that you can't define EA in a short definition or description. That's why enterprise architecture is a term that's defined in many different ways. Yes, they are somehow similar, but from your perspective, why do you think it's been so difficult to pin down a single and universal definition that explains how EA is defined, what are the roles and responsibilities within the organization?
So that's an excellent question. And I think the question actually is whether we truly want this universal definition, because I think just as there are many different types of organizations, these organizations also have different structural clarity and control needs. And I think due to these differences, the methods that used to meet these needs can differ as well. So in other words, enterprise architecture is executed and indirectly defined differently depending on how it is implemented in an organization. So I think generally enterprise architecture is a tool that helps organizations to achieve their business goals and business objectives. But there are several ways to do so. And each approach should, at least that's my belief, be tailored to the organization in question. So this is why I think enterprise architecture cannot usually be captured in this single universal definition unless it is very generic and very high level. So in my book, we talked about it last session, the book Getting Started with Enterprise Architecture, I summarized these most common definitions of enterprise architecture, including those, for example, from the TOGAF standard. And I tried to make them more understandable, because the book then aims to present this practical and pragmatic approach to enterprise architecture. And the same, of course, applies to its definition. So to answer your question, whether is it difficult to pin down a single universal definition, I think enterprise architecture is practiced differently in each organization, allowing it to help these organizations achieve their business goals and objectives. So the short answer would be no, I think not. There is not a single universal definition that applies each and every time.
Absolutely. And sometimes those differences cause confusion instead of clarity, whether having different industries or different environments, how EA is defined, how EA is implemented in such cases or in such organizations. And thank you so much for highlighting this diversity of thought. But also, we need to give the audience a mental map of the EA landscape. So can you walk us through some of the more common definitions that you have encountered in the industry and what they tend to focus on, each different terminology or each different definition?
Yes, of course I can. And just to name a few, there is Gartner for one. The definition states that, and we can see it here on the screen, enterprise architecture is actually the process of translating business vision and strategy into effective enterprise change by creating, communicating, and improving key principles and models that describe the enterprise's future state and enable its evolution. And then the TOGAF standards, to give just another definition, uses actually the definition from the ISO 4210 standard, which implies that the fundamental concepts or properties of an entity in its environment and governing principles for the realization and evolution of this entity and its related lifecycle processes. But then TOGAF also adds an additional line to this definition I just gave, saying that the structure of components, their interrelationships, and the principles and guidelines governing their design and evolution over time. Now, if you search for definitions of enterprise architecture on Google or even ask an AI chatbot, you will find a whole list of these definitions. And what they all have in common, though, is that they all mention the organization's strategy, core principles, and a shift from the current state to the future state. So therefore, I think you could say that enterprise architecture is defined generically as helping an organization translate this strategy into a feasible implementation by taking into account frameworks and guidelines and clarifying how to transition from as is to be, or current to future state. So, like I said, that's quite a mouthful, but the supporting nature of enterprise architecture clearly shines through in each and every definition.
Well, that's a great way, Eric, to frame it. Knowing how others define EA can help us understand their expectations, goals, and even pinpoints that they are trying to tackle. However, one of the things that I appreciated the most in your book, Getting Started with Enterprise Architecture, is how you boiled it all down to a working definition, something practical from my perspective. Based on that, can you walk us through the simplified working version of the EA definition, how you introduced in your book, Getting Started with Enterprise Architecture? And one of the most important points that I would like to tackle as well, why you felt the need to create this simplified definition or this simplified version?
Yes, of course. I think it was due to the variety of definitions and the sometimes difficult to understand language that is used in these definitions that I've included a kind of like summary of the common thread or the red herring running through all these definitions in my book. So that was really the general idea that I wanted to achieve, to have this generalized meaning in which all these definitions or the meaning behind the definition was combined. And in doing so, I arrived at the following. So enterprise architecture is perhaps best described as a framework for understanding and managing the overall structure and strategy of an organization. And it is also about creating this holistic view of the organization's activities, including its business processes, information systems, technology infrastructure, and most importantly, maintaining the coherence between them. So the purpose of enterprise architecture is to align these various elements with the goals and objectives of the organization, that is the strategy part, and to ensure that these elements work together efficiently and effectively. Now, enterprise architecture focuses on identifying and resolving inconsistencies in business operations and enables planning for future growth and development. So that's the definition that I used in my book as kind of like a combined definition from every definition of enterprise architecture that is out there. And as you can see, enterprise architecture cannot be that easily captured into a single comprehensive definition. Now, even the one I just mentioned will be interpreted differently by each organization. And of course, that's fine, and it should be done so. And I think that interpreting it for one's own organization actually helps to tailor the architecture to its needs. And I think that's what enterprise architecture is, or at least should be, all about.
I like how you made sure the key elements still stand out in this simplified version. Can you walk us through on the core components that you mentioned and you wanted to preserve or emphasize on in this definition? And why do you think these, I would say, elements or components are important for any organization to comply with or to use while they implement enterprise architecture in their context?
Well, I think it's very important for an organization to have a kind of control or have this overall structure clarity, if you will, with regards to the strategy an organization has and how to be able to achieve this strategy. And that's one of the things that needs to shine through in every definition of enterprise architecture. So that's kind of like the coherence that I was referring to. Everything an organization does, has, or uses, it needs to work together, like I said, effectively and efficiently. So those are really the main points of every definition. But also an organization needs or should want to move forward. So how does an organization can get to from where they are today to where they want to go tomorrow? That's the part of the current toward the future state. So there are these three main points of every definition in combination with having certain guidelines to move this organization forward. And those are 4 points of the definition that is used in my book.
I would say that's such a helpful lens, Eric, especially for people who need to explain enterprise architecture to executives, especially executives, teams, or even project stakeholders in plain terms. Most of the organizations I've worked for, they seem that they have different, I would say, lens for the enterprise architecture. So having a common ground, a common terminology across all the teams, all the layers of the organization should make impact. And the awareness is 100% the most important thing before you jump into the frameworks or the tools and so on and so forth. And that's why I would like to have a step back and talk about why this conversation matters at all. Some people say that you are discussing a very basic thing, which is defining enterprise architecture, and everyone can define enterprise architecture. But because some people want to skip definitions and jump straight into frameworks, I think this will create a lot of consequences and risks without first defining and agreeing on what EA really means for the organization. What is your insights about that?
Well, I think, as you call it, jumping into tools and frameworks without first defining what enterprise architecture means for your organization does indeed create risk and does have consequences. For example, consider misalignment with business strategy. I think the architecture effort might be driven by tools or frameworks instead of business goals. So there's a real risk of creating these beautiful architectural artifacts that don't really solve organizational problems. And enterprise architecture might become this technological exercise instead of a business enabling capability as it should be. This is one of the most common risks that I've observed in my country and perhaps even worldwide. And second, there is the risk of over complexity and what is called analysis paralysis. So frameworks such as the TOGAF standard can be very detailed, and without having this clear scope definition, teams may even try to do everything, which can overwhelm stakeholders with unnecessary documentation. So the architecture practice risks becoming bureaucratic rather than agile and pragmatic. And third, I think poor stakeholder engagement might also be one of the more frequently surfacing risks, because if stakeholders don't understand the rationale behind a particular enterprise architecture approach, they may resist it or ignore even its outcomes. So tools and frameworks may seem abstract or irrelevant to executives if they are not tied in to their priorities. And this may even result in enterprise architecture being labeled as the infamous ivory tower work. So therefore, I think it is important that before implementing tools and frameworks, that an organization should first define the purpose of enterprise architecture. So what problem are we going to solve? Think about alignment, standardization, transformation, decision support, and whatnot. But also scope is important. Does the architecture effort need to be enterprise or organization wide? Does it need to be IT only or a combination of business and IT? And then they should probably consider principles and even outcomes. So what are these guiding principles that we already mentioned in the definitions? What are the expected business outcomes? So this refers back to the definition that we discussed earlier and the need for having those guidelines. And last but not least, perhaps stakeholder needs. We should forget them. So who will use the architecture output and how, which way? And I think that once what I just mentioned is clear, tools and frameworks can be tailored instead of blindly followed. And that's another important thing. We shouldn't follow the tools and frameworks as the theory prescribes. We should always try to tailor it to the needs of our organization.
I can't relate more, Eric, and I've seen it happen a lot, where everyone working hard, but they are not working toward the same vision or having the same understanding of what exactly I should provide as a value. I would say that having a strong EA definition in place act as a kind of compass for new teams or practices that are just getting started. What do you think about this statement that having a set of standards, set of definitions, guidelines, aligning it with all the stakeholders, especially the executives and the business teams and IT teams, will this help us to have the compass towards what we are looking for?
Another great question, Omar, and I think it's an even better metaphor, viewing enterprise architecture as a compass, because it provides orientation, alignment, guardrails. It allows new teams to avoid aimlessness, rigidity, provides direction, provides purpose, and still allows room to determine the how in context. So an excellent metaphor. And this is also precisely what I meant when I said the definition of enterprise architecture differs or might differ from organization to organization, but it leaves room for the how. Now, one of the things enterprise architecture needs to do is to provide this shared understanding, this common language even. And this means defining enterprise architecture in the context of the organization rather than relying on textbook definitions. So EA must create this common language for architects, for business leaders, for delivery teams. And I think another important way that enterprise architecture can serve as this compass, as you call it, is by anchoring on purpose and value. Now, it explains why enterprise architecture exists. So, for example, it can enable strategy execution, reduce complexity, support innovation. New architects' practices can focus on business outcomes instead of getting bogged down in methodologies. And this will keep teams focused on delivering value instead of just producing artifacts. So clear definition also guides decision-making by providing consistency across teams. Rather than overwhelming newcomers in the field with complex frameworks, the definition then distills the essence of enterprise architecture for that particular organization. And I think finally, it can keep the architecture practice adaptive by focusing on the directional definition, just like a compass, ensuring that the organization isn't locked into a single methodology.
I 100% believe without a sharing understanding, even the best tools and frameworks can lead to the wrong direction. With what we already discussed and having a shared understanding and shared definition, along with the right tools and the tailored right framework. Of course, we're going to tackle this in the next episodes. But can you share with us a sample or a success story where a clear definition from the beginning, an awareness and understanding for all the executives, for all the teams and the stakeholders have really made difference in the EA value within the organization?
Yes, I think I can. And there was this, I've worked for many organizations over the past few years. I've been in the enterprise architecture profession for nearly 2 decades. So I've seen a lot of organizations, and there was this one organization that was really looking for some form of feeling of being in control, everything they did with regard to their application landscape. They were looking for some guardrails, perhaps is the best way to express it. And what enterprise architecture did for them, what I did, because I was their enterprise architect at the time, was create a set of very simple and easy to understand basic principles. There were 4 of them, if I remember correctly. And each of these principles was aimed at a specific layer of the organization. So there was one principle that would align with the organizational structure. There was this other one that would focus on the processes that were used in the organization, one on information, one on application and technology layers. So all the architecture domains were actually handled by these 4 basic principles. And because they were kind of generic, but also somewhat restrictive, it gave the organization a sense of being in control when they applied those principles to their daily work, to things they purchased, etc. So there were guardrails based on the definition. And if you remember correctly, I mentioned that having principles or guidelines as part of the definition of enterprise architecture to get an organization from where they are today to where they want to go tomorrow, then these principles are essential in everything they do. So having created this set of easy to understand guidelines for the organization gave them a feeling that they were actually in control when they were performing the tasks that they were meant to do. So that really helped the organization, and it showed the added value of using enterprise architecture.
That's wrap up this episode of the EA Explained video series, and hopefully it clears the fog around what EA really means and the several definitions of EA. Eric, thank you so much again for simplifying something that often seems somehow overcomplicated.
Yes, so Omar, thanks again for having me for this session. It's been another great one, and I hope the audience appreciates our effort to simplify these terms.
Thank you so much. And to our viewers, now that we have a working definition in place, we are ready to explore more complex topics, which are the layers and domains of the enterprise architecture. That's what we will unpack in the next episode. We will see you in the next one. Thank you.